A city born from a fratricide would one day rule the known world and then vanish into ruins. How does an empire that conquers everything end up conquering nothing? The story begins as the Romans told it, on the 21st of April, in the year we count as 753 BC. Two infant brothers, Romulus and Remus, sons of the god Mars and a princess named Rhea Silvia, were cast into the wild to die. But a she-wolf found them on the muddy banks of the Tiber, and she did not devour them. She nursed them. They lived. And when those boys grew to men, they quarreled over the hills where their city would stand. Romulus chose the Palatine. He traced a sacred boundary in the earth, a line that meant these walls, this ground, this people. And when Remus mocked him and leapt across that line, Romulus struck his own brother down. So Rome was founded on a murder. A city whose first act was a brother killing a brother, whose very name came from the man who spilled that blood. Hold on to that, because the violence buried in Rome's foundation would never quite leave it. The same fierce ambition that raised these walls would, 12 centuries later, help tear them down. It is not only legend. Beneath the Palatine Hill, archaeologists have uncovered the traces of real settlements from the middle of the 8th century BC. Humble huts, exactly where and when the story says Rome began. For more than 200 years, kings ruled this growing town. Then, in 509 BC, the Romans did something extraordinary. They drove out their last king, and they swore an oath that no man would ever again wear a crown over them. They called their new creation the Republic, a thing of the people. They had killed their kings and sworn never to bow again. But the men who would save Rome were about to become more dangerous than any monarch. The Republic was built to share power. Two consuls, each able to veto the other. Terms that lasted a single year. A Senate to hold ambition in check. No one man would ever rule again. That was the promise. But Rome grew hungry, and conquest changed everything. Legion after legion marched outward, swallowing Italy, crushing Carthage, sweeping across the Mediterranean. Spain, Greece, Egypt, Gaul, all bent beneath the eagle. And every victory poured gold and glory into the hands of the generals who won it. That was the flaw no one had foreseen. A man who conquered nations could buy loyalty no consul could match. Soldiers stopped fighting for Rome. They fought for the commander who paid them, fed them, and led them home rich. The legions had become private armies, and the men who held them became something the Republic was never meant to allow. They had names that still echo. Marius, who broke the rules of office again and again. Sulla, who marched on Rome itself and washed the Senate floor in blood. Pompey the Great, who carved kingdoms with his sword. And Julius Caesar, who crossed a small river called the Rubicon and dared the Republic to stop him. It could not. Civil war tore the city apart, faction against faction, legion against legion. Caesar emerged supreme, named dictator for life. And on the Ides of March, senators who feared a king plunged their daggers into him, certain they had saved the Republic. They had only killed it. The wars that followed were worse, and from the wreckage rose one man, Caesar's adopted heir, cold and patient and brilliant. He defeated his rivals, ended the bloodshed, and then performed the greatest illusion in Roman history. He gave power back to the Senate, and the grateful Senate handed it right back to him. In 27 BC, they called him Augustus. He held no crown, claimed only to be first among equals. But he commanded the armies, the treasury, and Rome itself. The Republic was finished. And now, the empire stopped reaching outward and turned to perfect what it had built. What does the most powerful empire on Earth actually look like at the very height of its strength? Not in the clash of swords, but in the quiet hum of a world at peace. For 2 centuries, from the moment Augustus took the reins in 27 BC, a stillness settled over the Mediterranean, unlike anything the ancient world had ever known. They called it the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. Borders held, pirates vanished from the seas, and for the first time, a merchant could carry his goods from the deserts of Syria to the rain-soaked hills of Britain under a single law, a single coin, a single name. Picture it, a morning in any provincial city. Stone roads stretch toward the horizon, straight as a drawn line, over 50,000 miles of them, binding the empire together like veins through a living body. Aqueducts march across valleys on towering arches, pouring fresh water into fountains and bathhouses. In the markets, the air is thick with the smell of bread and fish sauce, with the babble of a dozen tongues. Egyptian grain, Spanish olive oil, silk that began its journey in distant China, all flowing toward Rome and out again. And in the great baths, ordinary people, laborers, freed slaves, citizens, soak in heated pools, gossip, make deals, and pass the long afternoons. This was the everyday miracle of the empire, not just conquest, but comfort, shared across an astonishing scale. By the reign of Trajan, between 98 and 117 AD, that scale reached its absolute limit. The empire sprawled across nearly 2 million square miles, from the Atlantic to the Persian Gulf. Within its borders lived perhaps 60 to 75 million souls. 1 in every 4 or 5 human beings alive on Earth answered to Rome. It was a peace that would last until Marcus Aurelius drew his final breath in 180 AD. And yet, beneath this golden calm, the very things that made Rome great, its size, its appetite, its dependence on the man at the top, were quietly turning against it. Under Trajan, Rome ruled a quarter of humanity, and the seeds of its undoing were already taking root. For 100 years after Trajan, the rot stayed hidden beneath the marble. Then, in 235, the dam broke. In a single half-century, more than 24 men would claim the purple, and most would die by the sword, often at the hands of their own soldiers. This was the answer to a question Rome had never wanted to ask. What happens when the army that protects the empire realizes it can also make and unmake emperors at will? The answer was chaos. Legions on the Rhine raised one general, legions on the Danube raised another. Civil war became the empire's permanent condition. While Romans killed Romans, the frontiers bled. Goths poured across the Danube. Persians shattered Roman armies in the east and dragged one emperor, Valerian, into captivity. Trade routes that had carried grain and silver for centuries simply went quiet. Cities raised walls they hadn't needed in 200 years. And then came the plague. The sickness named for Cyprian swept through crowded streets and army camps alike, killing without regard for rank or borders, emptying fields of the hands that worked them. At the lowest point, the empire didn't even hold together. It cracked into 3. A breakaway Gallic realm in the west, the desert kingdom of Palmyra in the east, and a shrinking Rome in the middle. That Rome survived at all is astonishing. And it survived because of one hard, brilliant soldier emperor, Diocletian. Rising to power in 284, Diocletian looked at the impossible scale of the empire and made a radical decision. No single man could rule it all. So he split the burden. 4 rulers, 2 senior, 2 junior, governing the corners of the Roman world together. The Tetrarchy. He reorganized provinces, reformed the tax system, rebuilt the army, and tried to freeze prices by decree. It worked for a while. The bleeding stopped. The empire breathed, but the cure carried the disease. After Theodosius died in 395, the division became permanent. East and West, two halves, two destinies. The reforms had bought time. The West was now living on borrowed years. Those borrowed years ran out faster than anyone imagined. In 378, near the city of Adrianople, the Emperor Valens marched against the Goths, refugees turned warriors who had been driven across the Danube and then betrayed by Rome's own officials. The legions that had once carved the world were shattered in a single afternoon. Valens vanished in the chaos, his body never found, burned alive in a farmhouse by the men he had failed to honor. It was the worst defeat in centuries, and it announced a terrible truth. The frontier was no longer a wall, it was a door. After that, the emperors in the West became shadows. The real power passed to generals, half barbarian themselves, who commanded the armies and propped up boy emperors like idols. Stilicho held the line until he was executed by the very court he protected. And in 410, the unthinkable happened. The Visigoths under Alaric poured through the gates of Rome and sacked the Eternal City. For 3 days they plundered. 800 years since a foreign enemy had touched her walls, and the world simply stopped to mourn. Aetius rose, the last great Roman commander, and broke Attila's Huns on the fields of Gaul. Then he too was murdered by his own emperor. In 455, the Vandals came by sea and sacked Rome again, more thoroughly than before. The kingmaker Ricimer raised and discarded emperors like coins. And so the empire did not die in one great battle. It died slowly, hollowed from within, its purple robes worn by ghosts. In 476, a Germanic commander named Odoacer deposed a teenage emperor with the ironic name Romulus Augustulus and sent the imperial regalia to Constantinople. No one fought to save him. The last Western emperor simply stepped aside. And yet, did Rome truly fall, or did it only change its shape? That question has never stopped being asked. This whole world was built from a single prompt with Moovee.ai. What would you create?